What happens when a man who built his empire on secrets realizes the one person who knows them all is the woman he's been treating like she's invisible? The answer isn't what Park Jin-woo expected when he decided to humiliate his maid in front of the most dangerous men in Seoul. For 3 years, she'd been a ghost in his mansion, moving through rooms with her cleaning cart, her dark hands scrubbing away the evidence of his violent world. He never looked at her face. He never asked her name beyond the help. And he certainly never imagined that every whispered conversation he'd had in Russian, every secret deal he'd made, while she vacuumed the corners of his office, every betrayal he'd plotted while she served his tea, had been perfectly understood by the one person he thought was too beneath him to matter. This is the story of how a Korean mafia boss learned that the most dangerous weapon in any room isn't the gun on the table. It's the truth in the hands of someone you underestimated. Hello, bestie. Welcome to Black Diamond Stories. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we bring you the most jaw-dropping stories of hidden strength, sweet karma, and life-changing revelations. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's get into it. The crystal chandelier in Park Jin-woo's private dining room cast fractured light across the mahogany table, illuminating the faces of 6 men who controlled the underground economy of 3 countries. These weren't businessmen. They were architects of fear, each one responsible for operations that existed only in encrypted files and unmarked graves. At the head of the table sat Park, a man whose tailored suit cost more than most people's cars, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he gestured with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. The dining room itself was a monument to excess. Venetian marble floors stretched beneath Persian rugs that cost 6 figures each. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, most of them stolen from private collections across Europe. The table could seat 20, though tonight only the most trusted, or most dangerous, had been invited. The air smelled of aged whiskey, Cuban cigars, and the particular musk of men who believed themselves untouchable. To his right sat Dmitry Volkov, a Russian arms dealer with ice-blue eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a deal gone wrong in Chechnya. His hands were steady as he swirled his drink, the fingers of a man who'd pulled triggers without hesitation. To his left, Alexei Morozov, Dmitry's younger partner, a man known for his cruelty and his perfect memory. Alexei never forgot a face, a debt, or an insult. The other men at the table were enforcers, translators, and witnesses, bodies to fill space and nod at the right moments. The conversation flowed in a mixture of Korean and broken English, a linguistic dance that kept everyone comfortable in their respective power. Park's Korean was sharp and rapid, punctuated by laughter that sounded like breaking glass. The Russians responded in their accented English, careful to keep their true thoughts veiled behind diplomatic smiles. Except for one person. Standing against the far wall, next to a serving cart laden with expensive whiskey and imported cigars, was a woman in a plain black maid's uniform. Her name was Grace Thompson, though Park had never bothered to learn it. To him, she was simply the help, a position as interchangeable as the light bulbs in his chandelier. She was 43 years old, with deep brown skin that bore the faint scars of a life lived hard, graying hair pulled back into a tight bun, and hands that bore the calluses of 3 years spent cleaning a mansion that sprawled across 2 acres of Seoul's most exclusive real estate. Her eyes were dark and still, watching everything and revealing nothing. She had learned long ago that invisibility was survival. In a house like this, where violence was currency and loyalty was purchased by the hour, the safest position was to be overlooked. Grace had arrived in Seoul 3 years ago with nothing but a single suitcase and a heart full of desperation. Her husband, Marcus, had died in a construction accident in Atlanta, leaving behind medical bills that consumed their savings like wildfire. Their daughter, Zoe, had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition that required surgeries American insurance refused to cover. Grace had sold everything, their house, their car, her mother's jewelry, and it still wasn't enough. A friend of a friend had connected her with an agency that placed domestic workers in wealthy Asian households. The pay was triple what she could make in the States, and it came with housing. She didn't speak Korean. She didn't know the culture, but she was fluent in desperation, and that was a universal language. The agency had placed her with Park Jinwoo, a businessman, they'd called him. Grace had learned the truth within her first week. The men who visited at odd hours, the bloodstains she scrubbed from the marble, the conversations held in hushed tones behind closed doors, these were not the habits of a businessman. But by then, she'd already signed the contract, and Zoe's next surgery was scheduled. So Grace did what she'd always done. She survived. She learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Park took his coffee black at 6 a.m., that he hated wrinkles in his shirts, that he conducted his most sensitive meetings in the dining room between 9 and 11 p.m. She learned to move like smoke, present but unnoticed, her hands always busy, her eyes always down. And she learned languages. Grace had always had an ear for them. Growing up in a military family stationed in Germany, she picked up German from the local kids. During her father's diplomatic posting in Moscow, she'd spent 3 years in Russian schools, becoming fluent enough to dream in the language. Her husband had been first-generation Nigerian, and she'd learned Yoruba from his mother. Languages were the one gift life had given her freely. In Park's house, she'd added Korean to her collection, studying from books she borrowed from the library on her rare days off, listening to language apps on her phone while she scrubbed floors. Within 6 months, she could understand basic conversations. Within a year, she was fluent. But she never let Park know. Because in a house built on secrets, knowledge was the most dangerous possession of all. Park was in the middle of negotiating a shipment route when Dmitri leaned back in his chair, switching smoothly into Russian. His voice was casual, almost lazy, as he spoke to Alexei. The shift in language was deliberate, a code switch designed to exclude their host. "This fool thinks he's getting 40%, Dmitri said in Russian, his lips barely moving as he smiled at Park. "We'll let him believe it until the shipment clears Busan. Then we take the entire container and blame it on the Chinese. They're already at war with half the syndicates in the city. No one will question it." Alexei chuckled, a low, ugly sound. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he responded in the same language. "And if he pushes back, if he tries to retaliate?" "Then we make an example," Dmitri replied, his fingers drumming on the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "His daughter studies in London, doesn't she? Economics at King's College. 19 years old, pretty girl. It would be a shame if something happened to such a bright young woman. A mugging gone wrong. A fall from a balcony. These things happen in big cities." Alexei's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "I like it. Clean, efficient. Sends a message to anyone else who thinks about crossing us." Park laughed along with them, raising his glass in a toast. He had no idea they were discussing his destruction, planning the murder of his only child with the same casual tone most men used to discuss the weather. His Korean was smooth and confident as he spoke. "To profitable partnerships and mutual respect, gentlemen. May our collaboration bring wealth to all of us." The Russians clinked their glasses against his, their smiles never reaching their eyes. They drank deeply, savoring the expensive liquor and the even sweeter taste of impending betrayal. Grace moved forward to refill the whiskey, her movements so quiet she might as well have been a shadow. The serving cart's wheels didn't squeak. Her shoes didn't click on the marble. She had learned to exist without sound, a skill that had kept her employed and, more importantly, alive. She poured Dimitri's drink with steady hands, the amber liquid catching the light as it flowed into his crystal tumbler. As she stepped back, Dimitri said something else in Russian, his voice dripping with contempt. He didn't even look at her as he spoke. His eyes fixed on Park with predatory amusement. "Even his help is pathetic," Dimitri said, gesturing vaguely in Grace's direction. "Look at her, like a trained dog. I bet he doesn't even pay her minimum wage. These Koreans love their cheap labor." Alexei snorted, reaching for a cigar from the humidor on the table. "Does she even speak Korean? Or does he just point and grunt like she's some kind of animal? I've seen zoo handlers treat their chimps with more respect." The other men at the table laughed, a chorus of cruel amusement. One of Park's own enforcers, A man named Kim, who Grace had served dinner to 100 times, joined in the laughter without understanding the words. He simply laughed because his boss was laughing, because that was what survival looked like in this world. Park caught the tail end of their laughter and assumed they were enjoying his hospitality. He was a man drunk on his own importance, surrounded by enablers and terrified subordinates. The idea that his maid, a black woman who arrived before dawn and left after midnight, could be anything other than furniture never crossed his mind. But Grace understood every word. Every single word. She had heard the plan to steal the shipment. She had heard the threat against Park's daughter, a girl Grace had never met but had seen in photographs throughout the house. A smiling teenager in a graduation gown, a child on a swing, a young woman who looked like she'd been given every advantage in life and had no idea the foundation beneath her was built on blood. Grace's hands didn't shake as she set down the whiskey bottle. Her face remained a perfect mask of servile indifference. But inside, a calculation was taking place, a cold, mathematical assessment of options and consequences. For 3 years, she had listened. She had heard Park's conversations with his accountant about the offshore accounts in the Caymans, accounts that held enough money to fund a small nation. She had overheard his late-night phone calls with corrupt officials, bribes discussed in casual tones over coffee she'd brewed with her own hands. She had watched him beat a man unconscious in his study for the crime of skimming 2% off a delivery, then calmly return to dinner while she cleaned the blood from the marble floor with bleach and prayer. She had documented nothing. She had reported nothing. Because her daughter needed her alive, and speaking up in a world like this was a death sentence delivered with a smile. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had heard them threaten an innocent. Park's daughter, for all her privilege, had done nothing wrong except be born into this family. She was studying economics, probably dreaming of a normal life, unaware that men in a dining room 6,000 miles away were casually planning her murder. And Grace, who knew what it meant to fight for a daughter's life, who sent every penny she earned to keep Zoe's heart beating, couldn't stomach it. More than that, she understood the code. In this world of shadows and violence, there were still rules. Loyalty, even to a monster, had value. Betrayal, especially from guests who'd eaten your food and drunk your liquor, was the gravest sin. The Russians had violated that code. And Grace, invisible and underestimated, was about to make them pay for it. Park stood, raising his glass again, his voice booming with alcohol-fueled confidence. The whiskey had flushed his cheeks, loosened his tongue. He was in his element, surrounded by dangerous men who he believed respected him. "Gentlemen, I think this calls for a celebration. Grace." She stepped forward, her eyes cast down in the submissive posture he expected, the posture she'd perfected over 3 years of bowing and scraping. "Yes, Mr. Park." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, the voice of someone who'd learned that volume attracted attention and attention attracted danger. "Bring out the good champagne. The 2008 Dom Perignon. We're drinking to the future tonight, to success, to partnership." She nodded, a small, deferential dip of her head. "Right away, sir." She moved toward the kitchen, her steps measured and deliberate. Her mind was racing, calculating the angles, measuring the weight of what she was about to do. The kitchen was empty, the other staff having been dismissed hours ago. Park always kept the high-level meetings private, trusting no one but Grace to serve, because in his mind she was too simple to understand, too insignificant to matter. She opened the wine refrigerator, the cold air washing over her face as she retrieved the bottle of Dom Perignon. It was worth $3,000, a price tag that could have covered 2 months of Zoe's medication. She held it carefully, feeling the weight of it, the condensation already forming on the glass. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could serve the champagne, finish her shift, and walk away. She could let the Russians destroy Park, let his daughter become another casualty of a war she didn't know was being fought. Grace could collect her pay, wire it to Atlanta, and continue surviving in the shadows. Or she could speak. Grace thought of Zoe, 14 years old, lying in a hospital bed with tubes running from her arms and a scar down her chest from the last surgery. She thought of the way her daughter smiled when they video called, the way she pretended everything was fine, even though Grace could see the pain in her eyes. She thought of Park's daughter, a girl she'd never met, who was probably studying for exams right now, drinking coffee in a London library, completely unaware that her life had been measured and found expendable by men who'd never even seen her face. Grace made her choice. She returned to the dining room with the champagne, the bottle cold and sweating in her hands. She poured carefully, the golden liquid hissing as it filled the crystal flutes. The bubbles rose in perfect columns, catching the chandelier light. As she served Dimitri, he looked up at her with the kind of casual disdain reserved for insects. "Does your maid speak any civilized languages, Park?" Dimitri asked in English, his accent thick and deliberate. "Or is she just decoration, a little diversity higher to make you look progressive?" Park laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the marble. "Grace, she barely speaks Korean. I don't think she's ever said more than 5 words to me in 3 years. She's simple but reliable. That's all I need from the help." The table erupted in laughter. Alexei leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malice and champagne-fueled cruelty. "Maybe we should test her, see if she understands anything. We could make a game of it." Park, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of men he desperately wanted to impress, saw an opportunity for entertainment. His cruelty always increased when he had an audience, when he could perform his power for men he considered equals. He turned to Grace, his smile cruel and wide, revealing the expensive dental work that masked the rot beneath. "Grace, do you speak Russian?" She looked up slowly, her face a perfect mask of confusion. Her eyes were wide, her expression blank, the picture of someone who'd been addressed in a language they didn't understand. "Russian, sir." Her accent was thick, American and uncertain, the voice of someone struggling with even basic Korean. "Yes, Russian. These gentlemen are curious if you understand their language." She shook her head, her movements slow and apologetic. "No, sir. I only speak English and a little Korean. Very little. I'm still learning." She let her voice trail off, let herself seem small and embarrassed, a woman aware of her own inadequacy. Dimitri smirked, switching back to Russian as he addressed Alexei. The words came fast and confident, secure in the knowledge that no one at this table except his partner could understand. "See, useless. Park surrounds himself with incompetence. It'll make taking everything from him even easier. I almost feel sorry for him. Almost." Alexei laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Don't. He's built his empire on the backs of people smarter than him. He deserves everything that's coming." Park, understanding nothing, gestured grandly at Grace with the magnanimity of a king addressing a peasant. "See, I told you. She's simple, but she works hard. That's all I need. Intelligence in a maid is overrated. I just need someone to clean and stay quiet." The word simple hung in the air like a slap. Grace felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the weight of being reduced to nothing in a room full of men who believed their power made them untouchable. She'd felt this sting before, in 1,000 small moments over 3 years. Every time Park walked past her without acknowledgement. Every time his guests treated her like furniture. Every time she bit her tongue and swallowed her pride because Zoe needed her. But beneath the humiliation was something colder, sharper, a decision crystallizing into action. She straightened, setting the champagne bottle down on the serving cart with a soft clink that somehow cut through the noise of the room. The sound made several men look up, though they couldn't have said why. There was something different about her posture, something that had shifted in the air. When she spoke, her voice was no longer the quiet, deferential murmur of a servant. It was clear, precise, and fluent. The Russian that came from her lips was perfect, the Moscow accent unmistakable, the kind of fluency that could only come from years of immersion. "Mr. Volkov," she said, her words dropping into the room like stones into still water, "you should know that the shipment you're planning to steal is already being monitored by Interpol. The container number you discussed last week, HC4479, was flagged 3 days ago. There's an undercover agent embedded in the Busan Port Authority. Your entire operation is compromised." The room went silent. Not the polite silence of a pause in conversation, but the absolute, suffocating silence of a world that had just tilted on its axis. Dimitri's smirk vanished. His hand, which had been reaching for his champagne, froze in midair, the fingers curling into a fist. The scar on his face seemed to darken, the tissue going white with shock. Alexei's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, struggling to process what had just happened. Park looked between them, confusion twisting his features into something almost comical. He didn't speak Russian. He didn't understand what Grace had said. But he understood the reaction, the way the blood had drained from Dimitri's face, the way Alexei's hand had moved toward the inside of his jacket. "What did you just say?" Park demanded, his voice rising, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Grace, what the hell did you just say to them?" Grace turned to him, switching smoothly to Korean, her accent perfect, her grammar flawless. She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 years listening, learning, absorbing every nuance of the language while pretending to understand nothing. "I said, Mr. Park, that your guests have been planning to betray you since the moment they arrived. They intend to steal your shipment in Busan, frame the Chinese syndicates, and if you resist, they've discussed harming your daughter in London. Her name is Park Minjai. She studies economics at King's College. She lives in a flat on Stamford Street. They know her schedule. They know she walks home alone on Tuesday nights after her study group." The words landed like grenades. Park's face went from confusion to shock to a dark, murderous red. The transformation was instant, the pleasant mask of the host ripping away to reveal the monster beneath. His hand moved to the inside of his jacket, fingers wrapping around the grip of the Glock 19 he always carried. He turned to Dimitri, the gun emerging in one smooth motion, the barrel pointed directly at the Russian's forehead. His voice was low, trembling with barely controlled rage. "Is this true? Did you threaten my daughter?" Dimitri recovered quickly, his training as a negotiator kicking in. He was a man who'd talked his way out of executions, who'd negotiated with warlords and cartel bosses. He forced a laugh, waving his hand dismissively, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. "Your maid is delusional, Park. She's lying to cause trouble. Think about it. Why would she wait 3 years to say something? She's probably angling for money, trying to create conflict so she can position herself as valuable. It's a con." "Am I?" Grace's voice was calm, almost gentle. She reached into the pocket of her apron, her movements slow and deliberate so as not to alarm the men whose hands had all moved toward concealed weapons. She pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind used for language lessons, cheap and plastic and completely unremarkable. She'd bought it 6 months ago from an electronics store in Itaewon, paid cash, no questions asked. She placed it on the table, the small device looking absurd next to the crystal and champagne, and pressed play. Dimitri's voice filled the room, crystal clear, the audio quality perfect. "This fool thinks he's getting 40%. We'll let him believe it until the shipment clears Busan. Then we take the entire container and blame it on the Chinese." Alexei's voice followed, just as clear, just as damning. "And if he pushes back? Then we make an example. His daughter studies in London, doesn't she? It would be a shame if something happened to such a bright girl." The recording continued, playing out the entire conversation, every cruel word, every casual threat, every detail of the betrayal. The silence that followed was suffocating. Park's hand was shaking now, the gun trembling as rage fought with shock for control of his body. His face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. "You came into my home," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, each word forced through clenched teeth. "You drank my whiskey, you ate my food, you smiled in my face, you shook my hand, and you planned to destroy me. You planned to kill my daughter." Dimitri raised his hands slowly, his face a mask of forced calm, but his eyes were calculating, looking for an exit, measuring distances, assessing threats. "Park, let's talk about this. Business is business. We can renegotiate." "You threatened my child," Park roared, and the sound was primal, the cry of a wounded animal. Alexei made a move for his own weapon, his hand darting inside his jacket. It was a mistake born of panic, a reflex that sealed his fate. Park's men, who had been stationed outside the dining room doors, flooded in at the sound of raised voices. They were professionals, armed and loyal, paid enough to die for their boss if necessary. Within seconds, the Russians were surrounded. Guns materialized from shoulder holsters, waistbands, ankle holsters. The enforcers moved with practiced efficiency, disarming Dmitri and Alexei, forcing them to their knees with brutal efficiency. The Russians' own bodyguards, who'd been waiting in the outer hall, found themselves staring down the barrels of submachine guns, their own weapons confiscated before they could even clear leather. Park's head of security, a former Special Forces operator named Choi, pressed the barrel of a pistol to the back of Dmitri's head. "Orders, boss." Park didn't answer immediately. He was staring at Grace, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage, shock, and something else. Fear. Fear of what else she might know. Fear of how blind he had been. Fear of the woman who'd been invisible for 3 years and had just proven herself the most dangerous person in the room. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the gun still in his hand but no longer pointed at anyone. "How long have you understood?" 3 years, Mr. Park." The weight of that statement settled over the room like ash after a fire. 3 years. 3 years of secrets. 3 years of conversations he'd assumed were private. 3 years of deals made and crimes committed in the presence of a woman he'd treated like furniture. 3 years of his entire life laid bare before someone he'd considered too insignificant to matter. The implications were staggering. Park's mind raced, cataloging every conversation, every meeting, every moment of vulnerability. His hands began to shake for a different reason now. Not rage, terror. "Why now?" he asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. A man trying to understand a world that had just revealed itself to be far more complex than he'd imagined. "Why tell me this now? If you've known everything for 3 years, why stay silent? Why speak up tonight?" Grace met his eyes, her voice steady, her posture straight. She wasn't afraid anymore. She'd crossed the line and there was no going back. Fear was pointless now. "Because they threatened an innocent girl. Your daughter has nothing to do with your world, Mr. Park. She doesn't deserve to pay for your sins. She's studying economics. She wants to work for an NGO. She tells you this in your Sunday phone calls, but you're usually too distracted to listen. She doesn't know what you do. She doesn't want to know. And she doesn't deserve to die because of it." Park flinched. The detail about the Sunday calls, the NGO, the economics, these were things only someone who'd been present for those conversations would know. Someone who'd been in the room, silent and invisible, while he spoke to his daughter from his study. "And because I have a daughter too," Grace continued, her voice softening. "Her name is Zoe. She's 14. She has a heart condition. Every penny I've earned in this house has gone to keeping her alive. I know what it's like to fight for your child's life every single day. I know what it's like to do terrible things, to compromise yourself, to survive in a world that doesn't care if you live or die. Your daughter is innocent. I couldn't let them kill her for your mistakes." The silence that followed was different now. Heavier, more complex. Park lowered his gun slowly, his hand shaking. He looked at Dmitri and Alexei, both kneeling, both silent, their faces pale with the knowledge of what was coming. Then he looked back at Grace. "What else do you know?" It wasn't a threat. It was a genuine question from a man who just realized his entire empire had been observed, documented, and understood by someone he'd never even seen as human. Grace didn't hesitate. There was no point in hiding anymore. "I know about the accounts in the Caymans. Account numbers CY447821 and CY998234. I know about Police Commissioner Lee, who you pay $50 million every month. I know about the shipment of pharmaceuticals you're planning to move through Incheon next Tuesday, disguised as medical supplies for a charity. I know the names of the customs officials you've bribed. I know about the warehouse in Gangnam where you store the guns." I know about the politician you're blackmailing with photos from the room upstairs. I know the routes you use, the people you've killed, and the bodies you've buried. Park's men shifted uneasily. This wasn't just about the Russians anymore. This was about the complete and total exposure of everything Park had built, every crime, every secret, every vulnerability. Choi, the security chief, looked at Park with barely concealed alarm. "Boss, we need to." "Shut up," Park said quietly. His eyes never left Grace. "And what are you going to do with that information?" Park asked, his voice hollow, empty of the bravado that usually defined him. Grace picked up the recorder and slipped it back into her apron pocket. When she spoke, her voice was calm, businesslike, the voice of someone negotiating from a position of strength. "Nothing, as long as you do 3 things." "Which are?" "1, let me go. Tonight, I walk out of this house and you never contact me again. No retaliation. No revenge. I disappear and you forget I existed." Park nodded slowly. "And the second?" "You pay me what you owe me for this month, plus 6 months severance. 200 million won. That's what I calculate my silence is worth." It was a fraction of what she could have demanded, a fraction of what the information she possessed was actually worth. But it was enough. Enough to keep Zoe alive. Enough to start over somewhere new. "And the third?" Grace's voice hardened. "You get your daughter out of London. Tonight. You call her right now, you tell her there's a family emergency, and you send someone you trust to get her on a plane. You send her somewhere safe, somewhere these men's associates can't find her. You do it before I walk out that door." Park stared at her for a long moment, the chandelier light casting shadows across his face. He was doing the math, weighing the cost of letting her go against the cost of killing her. But he was also a father, and the fear in his chest when he'd heard that recording, the primal terror of a parent facing their child's death, was still fresh. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Done." He turned to Choi. "Pay her cash now." Choi hesitated for only a second before nodding and disappearing from the room. Park pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed. The call connected after 3 rings. Grace could hear the tinny voice of a young woman on the other end. "Minjai," Park said, and his voice cracked. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. There's been a situation. I need you to pack a bag right now. Uncle Sung is coming to get you. You're going to Jeju Island for a while. No, don't ask questions, just do it. Please, trust me." There was a pause. The voice on the other end sounded confused, worried. "I love you," Park said, and for the first time in 3 years, Grace heard genuine emotion in his voice. "I love you and I'm sorry. I'll explain everything when you're safe. Just go with Uncle Sung, right now." He ended the call and looked at Grace. "It's done." Choi returned with a black duffel bag, setting it on the table. He unzipped it, revealing stacks of bills. Grace didn't count it. Either it was all there or it wasn't, and counting wouldn't change what happened next. She picked up the bag, feeling the weight of it, the weight of 3 years of suffering compressed into paper and ink. Grace walked to the door, her steps measured and calm. She could feel every eye in the room on her, but she didn't look back at the Russians kneeling on the floor, didn't acknowledge the guns or the violence that was about to unfold. She paused at the threshold, looking back one last time at the man who had treated her like she was invisible. "For what it's worth, Mr. Park, you were never as smart as you thought you were. But you're not the worst man I've ever worked for. You paid on time. You never hit me. And when it mattered, you chose your daughter over your pride. That's more than most men in your position would do." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even kindness. It was simply the truth, delivered without malice or warmth. She walked out into the cold Seoul night, the duffel bag heavy on her shoulder, her phone already in her hand. The air was crisp, cleaner than it had been inside the mansion, where violence and expensive cologne mixed into a suffocating perfume. She walked 3 blocks before stopping to check her phone. The bank app showed a new deposit. The 200 million one had been transferred. She immediately initiated a wire transfer to the hospital in Atlanta, enough to cover Zoe's next 3 surgeries and 2 years of medication. Behind her, in the mansion, the sound of a single gunshot echoed through the halls. Then another. Grace didn't look back. She didn't flinch. She kept walking, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, her pace steady. She thought about Zoe, about the video call they'd have tomorrow, about telling her daughter that things were going to be okay now. She thought about Park's daughter, waking up confused in London, angry at being pulled from her life, not knowing she'd just been saved. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent invisible, and the single night she'd chosen to be seen. Grace had survived by being invisible. She'd endured by bowing her head and keeping her mouth shut. But tonight, she had saved a life by speaking up. She had wielded the power of truth like a weapon, and in doing so, had rewritten the rules of a game she'd never wanted to play. 3 blocks became 5. 5 became 10. By the time the sun rose over Seoul, Grace Thompson was on a train to Busan, and from there, a flight to Singapore. She was done being invisible. She was done surviving. It was time to live. So, bestie, let me ask you something. How many people in your life do you walk past every single day without really seeing them? The janitor, the cashier, the person who cleans your office. Park thought Grace was invisible, but she saw everything. She heard everything. And when it mattered most, she was the only one in that room who had the power to change the ending. This story isn't just about a maid and a mafia boss. It's about how we treat people when we think they don't matter, and how karma has a way of teaching us that everyone matters. Grace spent 3 years being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. But in the end, she held all the cards. She had the information, the leverage, and the courage to use it. And she didn't use it for revenge. She used it to save an innocent life. That's power, real power. Not the kind that comes from a gun or a bank account, but the kind that comes from knowing your worth even when the world tells you you're worthless. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me. Would you have stayed silent for 3 years, or would you have spoken up sooner? And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We've got more stories like this coming your way, stories of people who were counted out, looked over, and underestimated, but who rose up when it mattered most. I'll see you in the next one, bestie. Stay sharp, stay strong, and never forget, the quietest person in the room might just be the most dangerous.